Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the Charlotte Regional Championship results. It was a 2,133 player regional, the largest in our history. It has been going up and up and up over the last few tournaments, but this is a really monstrous milestone of breaking way over the 2,000 player threshold. We are going to look at the deck lists and also talk about a little bit before Liverpool, which is coming up this weekend. But we'll start by looking at the overall day 1 and day 2 deck representation, which is always an interesting thing to take a look out of. Charizard remained the most popular deck and sort of stayed strong at that 17 or so percent. Giratina in that second place slot, still below that 15%. It's a surprise to many, actually, I think, after winning the previous tournament, actually in a final as well, right? Both Tinas were first and second place, and it seems logical that it can be a decent challenger to Charizard and doesn't have any inherently terrible matchups. It feels like it should be among the top 3 in popularity going into the next few tournaments, but it does seem that like the skill cap of the deck possibly might be putting the general masses of the player base off, meaning that it's still just going to be below 15% going into the next few tournaments. Honestly, I think that's my expectation. I would not expect Tina to ever go above like 20%. Even something like 18% sounds like a really high amount. So I would expect around 15% going into the next tournament. Then interestingly, we have Miraidon in that 3rd place spot, but also Roaring Moon, another aggressive Squawkabilly, try and set the game rolling with an early game attack style deck. It's a really huge uptick for a deck that still only got 1 top 32 placement in the Portland Regional Championship. But when there are some high-profile players like Ross Cawthorn getting a pretty solid placement with the deck, and once again bringing it to this tournament, interestingly, which we'll have a look at in a moment for an even better finish, it seems like people were gaining confidence in this archetype. And as we started to look towards Giratina, Mew being a pretty decent check to Giratina, as long as the Tinas weren't teching like a Spiritomb, and Charizard, Moon's actually quite good into all of those matchups, I want to say, especially with the recent emergency jelly technology where you're trying to stay out of range of a Cramorant hit or a Sableye hit back after you've used a frenzied gouging. So it allows that Moon to be a little bit more aggressive and just freely gouge basically anything, knowing that you probably are going to get knocked out, but it's at least going to be by another multi-prizer coming back your way, so you can continue that chain of multi-prize threats. And of this, top 6 archetypes you can see on the screen right now, I think the only archetype I'm worried about playing as Roaring Moon is Gardevoir, and that's, the bottom of the pile right now. Miraidon's like that 50-50, and I think against Mew you're fairly favoured, and Tina, I think it's pretty solid as well. Charizard also like a really close matchup, but in terms of the top decks in the game right now, it makes sense for Moon to be in that conversation, in that mix, because it's fast, has great tempo plays available to it, fairly consistent, and its matchups are actually pretty solid. So it wouldn't surprise me if Moon continued to be on the graphic coming into Liverpool. I think possibly this is higher than expected, and it may cool off a little bit. It did get a top 8 placement and some great top 16 placements, so I could be completely off on that, but it feels like if Charizard EX wants to play Radzard, for example, they're going to have a better time into Roaring Moon once again. And because Radzard is just a generally good card, we saw Azul talking about Expert Belt plus Radzard as a package in his deck list, which we'll actually see in the top 8 as well, as a sort of Giratina answer. That could also cover Roaring Moon as well. So possibly the weekend for Roaring Moon was indeed this one, and we'll see with some really high placements. And it may be slightly worse positioned for Liverpool, so something to bear in mind. But as we go over to the day 2 bracket, you can see that Roaring Moon actually had a pretty good conversion, 9% in the day 1 field, then upticking. Tina doing very, very well as well. Charizard holding steady, honestly. Like, going from 17 to 14 is a bit of a drop, but for how popular the archetype is, still having a pretty solid conversion. Gardevoir doing pretty well. Mew holding solidly, and Miraidon kind of like the big loser of the day 1 field, but still hanging on in there in the graphics. So really it's a slight rejig. Seeing that Tina overtaking the Charizard is a bit of a talking point. And as I just mentioned, because the day 1 field was okay for Roaring Moon, it doesn't surprise me that it had a good day 1 to 2 conversion, because the matchups it was likely seeing in that day 1 field were generally favourable, or at least balanced. And then just before we get into the deck list themselves, just for a more full context of the decks that made that day 2, you can see the graphic there with the most popular decks, but also Lost Box did pretty well. If you combine Sablezard and the Losty variants with Gates, it actually did better than Miraidon. And then we have Snorlax with 8 in day 2, Goldengo with 7, and then of the other decks that you can see on this graph here, it was Rapid Strike, Arceus, and Entei all with 6 in day 2, Chien-Pao with 4, and then Zorobox and a Cloth made it into day 2 as well, which is fun to see. It's really cool to see that a number of Brazilians made the trip over. They have so few regional tournaments themselves that coming and playing in the US does seem quite worthwhile, especially when you have great placements like Vinny and Gustavo were able to do. Vinny Fernandez, a really solid player, has been doing well over the last couple of seasons, and of course their brother is a world champion as well. So a really accomplished family, and it looks like Giratina was the way to go. Back-to-back regional wins for Giratina, pretty impressive stuff, and Vinny is just going for the no-nonsense base build of Tina, really. The only card that you consider really a tech is that you're playing the Avery in the deck list. It's an extra just draw supporter in panic situations, but it is trying to tip those scales against the Gardevoir matchup. It can be great for just unlocking things like Jirachi or Manaphy that other decks are attacking against you, so if you expect Tina to be on the radar, the Avery can sort of offset the opponent's tech benched Pokemon, because you can still just wipe them off the board essentially, which can be really handy. And it can be okay into the Mew matchup as well, because even when Path isn't in play and sticking, which is obviously one of your key defenses against the matchup, they have already lost a few Pokemon, so when their Genesects are unlocked, they still can't go fishing for the big power tablet combos to get through your V-Stars. So Caleb Rogerson was able to get second place with Charizard Pidgeot, the Arvanzard, and as mentioned, was incorporating the Radiant Charizard and the Choice Belts. Funny story that Azul actually made a video about the list he would play going into Charlotte, were he playing Zard Pidgeot, and it incorporated Radzard and Belt, and this is certainly going to be a tech inclusion to help out against the Giratina matchup, as well as being good just naturally into Miraidon players, especially because there are EXP share builds of Miraidon going around now. They actually have a means of getting like multiple Raichu hits off in the game, which is becoming more dangerous, so having a single prize option is really handy, and I think just profiting from the random amount of Roaring Moon which showed up, which is also pretty cool to see. Just gone down to the one counter catcher to fit in these techs, but it's more of the same really for the archetype. Gustavo Wada has been playing Gardevoir for months now in all different formats and has once again had a really fantastic placement. I think it's no surprise to see the double research plus quad Iono be the best performing Gardevoir, because you really do need to have that supporter draw on top of your just ball search options. In the opening stages, it feels more and more like these are mandatory includes. It's also interesting to see that Professor Churros make its way into the deck list to give you a bit of respect against Snorlax, which I think is reasonable, but it's just another way that you can skew that prize race by picking up your Gardevoir to force that one prize map a little bit more often. A Peony Miraidon also picked up a top 4 placement. I really like a lot of the elements of this deck list, actually. Really great choice to, I think, play Research alongside Peony, because so often you're working on fumes that the fact that a Research can get you back into this large hand size to sit on is really huge for me, and I think it's a really nice choice from Brian to weave it in. Also, you see that EXP shares that we saw Nick Moffat piloting to a really great finish once again incorporated here, even more so than before, I feel, with the 3 EXP share and a couple Town Store to help you in that endeavor. Establish them early so you can make those huge dynamic spark plays, or just have your next attacker lined up a little bit more concretely. Looks like Ryan wanted to go for the Drapion rather than the Spiritomb. It feels like a much more stable way of answering the Mew V Max matchup when you have 2 big one-hit KO options in the deck. Definitely makes a lot of sense here. And also the double Pokemon Catcher making its way into Miraidon. I think it makes sense when you're only playing 2 copies of the Boss's Orders here that sometimes the Peony or the Research can dig you into the situation where you can coin flip for victories, and we actually saw that in the Top Cup games as well. These Pokemon Catchers coming in clutch. So there's a lot I do really like about this list. It seems to be a great way to boil down the Peony build and still have the explosive draw of Research once you've used the sort of early game Peonies to cherry pick the likes of Generators. In the mid game, you're still wanting to research and see a huge number of cards to then force the opponent back in a situation of wanting to hand disrupt. So yeah, I think this is a really well built list, and honestly I'm more confident in a build like this than to previous Peony lists, because it feels a lot less all in my opinion. Alex Szymanski piloted Sablezard to a top 8 placement. Some other interesting inclusions here. Unlike Christian Fontenot's build, it's subbed out the Spiritomb for Drapion once again. Obviously we're playing a huge number of stadium bounces, so you can get the wild style ability active again, so you can take those one-hit KOs. It's incorporated the double Raihan, so you can get the explosive Charizard response on Iron Hands, of course. And I do think if ever there's an archetype that's good into Giratina, it would be something like this, where you can be more Puritan single prize the entire game, whilst having this really great upgrade potential. You're blocking a Giratina's use of Sableye, whilst you have your own being able to take those like 1.5 prize turns, which could be really dangerous. So I'm still a massive fan of the core of Sableye Charizard being a great combo in a Lost Zone build. There were 2 other Giratinas in top 8. Isaiah Bradner chose to play Manaphy and Spiritomb in the deck list as sort of tech Pokemon. And interestingly, Russell was also playing the Avery in the deck, similar to Vinny, but chose to play Drapion V rather than Spiritomb. I think Spiritomb is better specifically in Giratina because it's so difficult to bounce path of the peak. I suppose you can gate to Drapion if you really have to, but it feels like a weak choice to me. So real surprised to see Drapion in there over Tomb overall. I think going into the next set of tournaments, Tomb still seems like a lot of value to me. It's Europe after all, so there's definitely going to be Mew showing up. Which leaves us with Ross Cawthon's Roaring Moon list. They got a top 64 placement in Portland and have made some tweaks and adjustments going into this event. Cawthon chose to put in a Town Store into the deck list to try and cherry pick / protect some of the crucial tools for the matchup. You can notice the Emergency Jelly. I actually played Roaring Moon to a cup myself last weekend and decided to have Jelly plus Town Store as a package in my deck so that you can have those aggressive gouges and put yourself back to 150 hit points remaining to try and entice out more multi-prizes to get that response KO. So I do think that's a massive card, certainly for the Tina matchup. Ancient Boosters, still really solid, obviously, just for giving yourself that huge hit point buff. Then we come to a really wacky support account, to be honest with you. There is one Pal Pad in here, so you can recycle some of these when they are important, but there's just one copy of Judge, one copy of Iono, 2 Boss, 2 Sada, and 3 Research. I think the general consensus when we were initially building Roaring Moon was that Sada was the crucial supporter card, because it's obviously a great way to accelerate energy, but Cawthon has said that just seeing more cards is more important, and allowing the Dark Patch and E-Switch with Galarian Moltres V combo be, on many turns, the way that you just continue your chain of Roaring Moon, and Sada can pitch in during the game to just maintain your attackers throughout. Whereas by having the Judge, Iono, and Pal Pad option can give you that late game disruption that's required, whereas Judge is obviously the more proactive disruptor. I can definitely foresee this being quite strong into the Lost Zone matchups. One thing I will say about an archetype like this is that you do get caught in the crossfire of Spiritomb, so if we do see players picking up Bradner's most recent 60 of Tina, the heavy reliance on Moltres rather than Sada can be punishing, so if you're expecting Spiritomb, that also does collateral this build of Roaring Moon, and there have been tons of different variations of Roaring Moon lists that also did well, multiple top 16 placements in Charlotte this weekend, so I think it's still being figured out, this deck list. I don't think, even though Ross is a fantastic player, has put a lot of time into Roaring Moon, that this is necessarily the perfect 60. And as we saw, Ross changed a huge heap of cards from Portland to Charlotte, so they're still actively making decisions to upgrade the deck as they go. For the other big headlines, like we said, it wasn't just Ross getting a high placement of Roaring Moon, there was 2 others in top 16, which is really cool to see. There was also a couple Arc Gigas in top 16, which is kind of interesting. Bakani off a top 8 placement, then came back and got 9th on the bubble, I believe, which is pretty insane. And a few other players also piloted the same 60 to relatively high placements as well. This time choosing to play a 3-3 barrel line, which is a real statement. For me, I'd look towards having 2 VIP pass in the deck. I know it sounds kind of copium, but whenever I play Arceus style builds and I only have the 4 Nest, the 4 Ultra, I still squint at that and get a little bit worried. So I'd really like to have the VIP in here. Obviously good for getting Bidoof established early, but can also be a pseudo way into energy if you get Zacian plus Arceus, or if you are trying to make that play, if you already have access to the Zacian, you can get double Arceus, get a turn attachment on one, raw to the other. So that would be something that I would look towards rather than having this really thick barrel. I get the logic here, you just want to see the cards early, but if they're dead cards anyway, VIP seems like the better deck thinner and the better card that you can see in your opening hand, but that's just me. Also seeing the Morwhile in here. Tempting Trap is making some low-key waves. I have seen some Lost Zone builds also try to incorporate not just 1 copy, but 2 copies, so you can play around Lost City and Zard and get a second Morwhile established and do this Tempting Trap. So if you are looking to play Zard and possibly even Guardy, I think you need to have your wits about you for these Tempting Trap plays that opponents might be trying against you. Also, major shout out to Jarek, who's got the first Goldengo top 32 placement. It's actually insane how much I play against Goldengo. You'd think it would be like the best deck in the format, the amount I come up against it on the ladder. But yeah, shout out to Goldengo. The believers have finally got there, and it's had a pretty solid placement. That's it then for the Charlotte Regional Championships. Let me know your thoughts down below, what you're going to be taking to Liverpool as well. What do you think is going to be the most popular archetype in the room, and what do you think is going to take it all down? I'll hear your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.